Hi, I'm Chanel. The debate around the proposals of introducing assisted dying legislation to the Isle of Man is still continuing. This week, Baroness Tanni Grey-Thompson and Dr Gordon Macdonald from Care Not Killing spoke to Tynwald members about their concerns.
We've just come over to share with the members of Tynwald experience from other parts of the world where assisted suicide or euthanasia has been legalised, because obviously you have an ongoing debate here within the island. And it's important to see what's happened elsewhere, because what's happened in other places is likely to also happen here if you change the law.
Right.
So I'm going to be talking about my experience as a disabled woman and a lot of the discrimination I face. I'm treated three very distinct ways. One as a Paralympian, one as a parliamentarian, and then the third is as a disabled person. I do experience a lot of discrimination and some of my personal worries, but also in my job, I work in a legislative process where, there's lots of unforeseen consequences of legislation, and talking about the reality of what happens if a bill like this is passed.
Now, have you guys both been following it from last year, from when Dr. Allinson first mentioned it?
Yeah, so this is an area that I work in and have done for at least the last 15 years. So we're always very interested in what's happening in different jurisdictions, what's being proposed, but also how over time every jurisdiction that's introduced it, while the legislation might not have changed, practice has become more open, and it's been open to a much, much wider group of people. So although I'm not very keen on the term slippery slope, it is one that gets across what happens in every jurisdiction around the world.
Would you like to add?
Yes, I mean, obviously we are aware of what's been happening and have been kept informed by colleagues on the island. But as Tanni has said, our principal concerns are that wherever the law has changed, people who are in a vulnerable position because of either disability or just being elderly or ill or other reasons, find themselves feeling under pressure to end their lives prematurely. And that pressure might not be from other people, it could be from other people, but it might be internal, just through to depression or other factors, financial pressures or other things. And so the question is can you have a bill which is truly safe? It's all very well people talking about safeguards, but our observation from other jurisdictions is that these safeguards either get eroded or they don't get implemented in the first place, and that they're there on paper, but in practice people are not actually truly safe.
Now, is that your concern? I know I spoke to an organization, an organization that dealt with autism, and they said their fears were, if the bill was passed now, in a few years down the line, it will be altered to include more people with disabilities, people with autism, people with all sorts of things. Is that what's one of y'all's main concerns?
For me as a disabled person, absolutely, because there's overt discrimination, but there's also the low-level daily discrimination of people being told they have no value, they can't contribute to society, that they cost too much, and it is a massive worry. We see it all over the world that quite often disabled people are assumed to have no value, even they do contribute a lot to society, and once you change that relationship between an individual and the state, you can't close the door. And we've seen in lots of other places, either it's expanded or palliative care is massively cut, and that has a huge implication for the whole of society.
And there are two ways in which the law could expand. One is by a court ruling that the law is discriminatory, and that's happened in Canada and in Oregon and in some other US states in Washington where laws have been expanded because of court rulings. But also, no parliament can bind its successor. So as society comes to accept that death is an option for serious illness and that medics should be involved in killing their patients, then that becomes normalised, and that changes people's mindsets, it changes the view of society, and it changes the view of the medical profession. Then over time, that then influences the politicians, and then they introduce a wider law, because there is always some group of people that don't qualify. And there's always another sad case, and they are tragic cases, but there's always another tragic case which doesn't qualify. And so once you've accepted the principle, it's very difficult to draw a line, an arbitrary line in the sand, and say, well, this person can have it, but this person can't have it.
When the consultation phase was open, did any of you write in to Dr. Allinson or respond to it?
Our organisation would have submitted a response as an organisation, and obviously those people who support us, who live on the island, would have been encouraged to submit their own views as well.
Right. Now, Tanni, at the beginning you mentioned that you wanted to speak about some of your experiences. Would you mind sharing some of that with us?
Yeah, so, I was 5 years old when someone stopped me in the street and asked me why my parents hadn't terminated the pregnancy. And having to sit down with mum and say to her, well, what does that mean? So, I experienced some low-level discrimination, but also I experienced, quite direct discrimination. So, I can't get on a train. I live in England. That legislation was meant to change, so by January the 1st, 2020, all trains were meant to be step-free. Every government's kicked the can down the road, and it's now 2070. I won't be alive when trains are step-free in England. We see discrimination in education. I've experienced that. Discrimination in work. And it just all builds up. I'm a really resilient person. But I've also had people say to me, if my life was like yours, I'd kill myself. And I have a massive amount of privilege in my life. I'm very protected. And if the assumption is that my life is really bad, then what about other disabled people who don't have the support or the resilience that I do? So it's very easy to see groups of disabled people thinking that they have no choice. And on the back of COVID, where health and social care has been restricted, people have a choice if they've got a 15-minute care visit. They can either eat or go to the bathroom, and you can't have both. It's very easy to see that disabled people will feel they have no other choice but to go down this route.
What is your message to that disabled person that's listening to this right now, that feels as though they're going down that slippery slope?
Opinion really matters. The reality is people don't campaign to keep the law the same. There's a massive incentive for people who want to change the law. And it's really important people speak up and talk about their experiences and talk about the fit. That is really hard for people to do. But once the law's changed, there's no going back.
And sorry.
I think it's also important that the members of Tynwald listen to those who are not so vocal, because there are some people who are very noisy and are very well resourced and making a campaigning, obviously, for a change in the law. But lots of people who are less vocal have concerns about this, and so members of Tynwald have to actually listen to all voices in this.
What are you hoping, Dr. Gordon, what are you hoping to achieve from today?
I think we just want to help the legislators to understand the complexities of this issue. It appears at superficial level as being something which is easy to decide, but actually in practice it's an awful lot more complicated. There are an awful lot of implications, not just for small groups of people, but for the whole of society. And so it's to help them to think it through. And indeed, every time in the UK, where we are from, that this has come before a parliament, whether it's at Westminster or in the Scottish Parliament, the politicians, as they've thought more about it, they've come to the conclusion it's just not safe to do and that they shouldn't progress with it. And I suspect that will happen here too.
Is there what are your fears if it does pull through?
I mean, I think our principal fear is what it will mean for people who would be in a vulnerable position on the island. And the thing to remember about vulnerability is that all of us at some point in our life will be vulnerable, particularly as we approach the end. There are also implications for the healthcare system. Can the healthcare system cope? What will be the financial pressures that might come to bear? But also, there are, obviously from our perspective as people who live in the UK, there are concerns about what the implications might be in terms of knock-on effects elsewhere. Because the Isle of Man will be held up by those who want to see a change in the law in the UK as an example that the rest of us should follow. And as I've said, it's not that this issue hasn't been debated. It's been debated many times, certainly over 12 times in the parliaments in the UK over recent years. And it's been thoroughly debated, even as short time ago as just in the last couple of years in Westminster. So it's the arguments have all been well rehearsed, and yet every single time people have turned away from it. And I think that the Isle of Man politicians should reflect on that.
I think for me, it's the unforeseen consequence of legislation. So, every bit I work on, however much detail you go into, there are things that aren't intended to take place. And one of the things I think the Isle of Man needs to consider is whether this becomes a home for suicide tourism, because it will be seen as a easy or convenient place for people to come. I think also you have to consider how, we talked about how it changed the relationship with doctors, recruitment, whether people want to be involved or not. It could have massive implications for people in the healthcare system who don't want to end their lives or don't want to be in this, but actually whether people will want to be qualified and work here because of how it could change.
Now, you mentioned, I think the word was debt tourism. If I can put this to you, and you can tell me if you want to comment, I think it was early last year, I picked up my phone, my desk phone rang, and I picked it up, and it was a guy from, I think, somewhere in the UK, and he'd been following the bill. And he said, I've been diagnosed with this, and I've got so many illnesses, and I do not want to carry on. And he said, if the Isle of Man does pass the bill through, he will be looking to move over. Does it show that other people, even normal residents in the UK, are also looking to the island?
I mean, we don't know the numbers, but if you just extrapolate that out, it's very possible that people would choose to come here. In the process leading up to their life being ended, that has complications and implications, and consequences for people living here. In terms of whether it's tax or healthcare support and all those different things. One thing I'm really worried about is that in jurisdictions where this is brought in, there's an implication for palliative care. I mean, one thing we don't talk about death because it's not pleasant to talk about, but every time we hear a story of somebody who will say there's irreconcilable pain, or that's a real worry, because I have massive concerns people aren't getting access to specialist palliative care. This is people who can help and support. So you look at New South Wales, where it's been brought in, palliative care has just been slashed. So now what's seen or people are told is a choice is not a choice, because there is lack of access to palliative care. So it's all these things that you have to think about as well. And we look at every case that we can in terms of why people might choose to do this or not. And in a lot of cases, it's that lack of access to specialist palliative care is a real problem. There is no reason that people should be experiencing irreconcilable pain. It just shouldn't happen.
Do you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I think the issue about suicide tourism, or migration as is more likely in this case, is that residency is not always easy to define in law, and people can be dual residents, they can be temporary residents, etc. So you may very well have people who are seeking this option, and you've got to remember that a third of people who even get a prescription for lethal drugs don't actually take it. So there's a huge psychological element in this whole debate. So you will have people moving to the Isle of Man for that psychological crutch, if you like, who will then be a financial cost and resource cost on the existing healthcare services in the Isle of Man, which will obviously have an impact on local people. And it's very difficult to avoid that from happening. The cost of living with a terminal illness for a family, never mind for the healthcare services, is between £12,000 and £16,000 a year. So there are financial implications for families as well as for, obviously, the services.
And would you like to see more being done in the palliative care on that side? More focus?
Absolutely. There is a excellent palliative care in the UK, but it could be a lot better, and the same will almost certainly be true in the Isle of Man. What we see is that specialist palliative care services are very well developed, but out of hours services, weekend services, in the community services are not so well developed. And so we fear that some of the stories which hit the press are because of lack of access to palliative care in these other settings. And 1 in 4 cancer patients in the UK don't get access to all the palliative care services that they would need. And so that's where the politicians should be focusing their attention and plugging that gap. And you've got to remember that maybe only 20 to 30% of specialist palliative care funding comes from the government. The rest of it's raised by charitable activities. So it's the one area of healthcare where we all need it eventually, or most of us will need it eventually, and yet it is the least adequately resourced.
Right. So people, when the whole discussion was going on, people were saying, isn't it ironic during COVID, hospitals and the healthcare system, you were doing everything in your power to keep people alive. And now you've got this whole debate 2 or 3 years later where you're even thinking of, should I be looking at introducing this? Would you like to comment? Or
So in England during COVID, compulsory do not attempt resuscitation orders were put on thousands of disabled people without their knowledge or permission, which basically said you won't be taken to hospital, but if you even get to hospital, you will not get a ventilator when they thought that was the right form of treatment. So, that for me highlights a massive issue in terms of attitudes towards disabled people, and why I have a real fear of a law like this coming in, because it's seen, disabled people's lives are just discounted, and certainly where I live, the support for the NHS, is really important. We are really lucky to have the NHS. We do. I've travelled to lots of places that don't have that kind of support, but this will fundamentally again change our relationship with NHS, with doctors, with society, and disabled people will just be made to feel they have no value. You'll either be a Paralympian where you're supported and lauded, or you're a scrounger. And we've seen that in recent years as well. You're one or the other, and one has some value to society, and by far the largest group is seen as not having any value to society.
I think the other thing is that with COVID, obviously, as you said, a huge resource was put into saving lives, but also with suicide prevention, a huge effort is put into saving people's lives. And that's recently been discussed over here in the Tynwald too. But what happens is if you legalise assisted suicide or euthanasia, you actually undermine that suicide prevention strategy. So there has been some research that shows that suicide rates overall go up, and non-assisted suicides don't decrease. And one of the strong arguments which is put forward by campaigners for a change in the law is that people will commit suicide if they're terminally ill because they don't have access to this. But if that were the case, you would expect the suicide rate to decrease when the law is changed, and it doesn't happen. So that suggests that what happens is you get a normalisation of suicide, and overall suicide rates will increase.
Dr. Gordon, I know that is it a foundation, your charity?
It's a campaign.
Your campaign. I know your campaign tracks and reads up about all of the latest things that's going on. Have you noticed any trends, or have you noticed anything recently that you can share with us?
I think what we're seeing is, particularly within the British Isles, I mean, this debate's been going for a long time, but within the British Isles, the UK, Ireland, the Crown dependencies, there's always been a reluctance to take that step. In some other jurisdictions, obviously the law has changed, sometimes because of courts, but there's always been a reluctance here, and I think it's been because we have understood that we have a responsibility for each other. We have a sense of a common wealth in that sense, a common responsibility to look after and assist those who are less vulnerable than ourselves. And it would be a sad day, I think, if we were to lose that.
Graham, I just went straight into it and I didn't even come to you. I'm so sorry. Would you like, what would you like to say? Would you like to add anything to this conversation that's been going on?
Thanks, I'm Graham McCall. I'm a retired GP and surgeon and GP trainer living on the Isle of Man. Yes, thanks. Well, I endorse, obviously, the points that have been made very much. And our concern very much is for the vulnerable in the Isle of Man, people who come to see themselves as a burden, or are made to feel that they're a burden. We know that so many adults are abused. Calls to Silver Line in the UK are huge. So we know how do we imagine that this is not going to be abused. And we see from jurisdictions, particularly like Canada, where the vulnerable have requested assisted suicide, euthanasia, and what has happened is even if they haven't fulfilled the criteria strictly, they've emphasized their suffering so that they could fulfill the criteria, and then they've left videos saying, actually, it was because of my poverty. So these things slip. That's the problem.
Sorry.
So I was just going to say, on the point about Canada, the interesting thing about Canada is that not only have the numbers increased so rapidly and how quickly the law has expanded, but now we're seeing more and more stories coming out of Canada where people are essentially having euthanasia or assisted suicide suggested to them by professionals, whether it be healthcare or other professionals, where they're actually asking for other support. They're asking for social support, for a wheelchair ramp or a stair lift or something like that. And then completely inappropriately, people say, well, have you considered medical assistance in dying, as it's euphemistically called? So, and there are lots of these stories. There was a case recently in Canada where a lady went to the emergency department. She was suicidal. She knew she was suicidal. She went to the emergency department and she was looking for help, and she was told, well, you're going to wait a few months before you can see a psychiatrist. And in the process of the conversation, the doctor asked her, have you considered medical assistance in dying? Now, whatever the doctor's intention, it was interpreted to be a suggestion. And so this is the problem. And that is what's different actually now, is that we're seeing some of these horrific stories really hitting the press.
Is it because it's the easy way out? Or, yeah.
I think there are two factors at play. One is the financial costs of care, which is under-resourced, and the Canadian Parliament has looked at the cost savings that have been made from medical assistance in dying. And the other, I think, is that once you protocol something within healthcare and people feel it's a healthcare right, then staff feel that they have a responsibility to raise it, and not only raise it but offer it, and therefore it changes the relationship between the doctor and the patient, and also it changes palliative care. So even end-of-life care, palliative care is now finding that whereas previously they wouldn't have entered into this sphere, now they are being required by regulation and by law to participate in it.
And of course the bill on the Isle of Man currently will forbid medics from raising the subject, but that means that's also difficult, because so supposing a medic says, well, of course, what else can be done, or maybe a nod and a wink, or how, and then one worries about are the medics going to be putting themselves in the litigation, because the family says, oh, you suggested it when you weren't allowed to, so you suggest it or you don't. It's a huge problem for health staff.
As a retired GP on the island, have you spoken to anyone that's still in the field about their concerns around this?
So just clarify.
About this bill, as a retired GP, have you spoken to any other GPs that's still practicing about their fears around this bill?
Well, we know, yes, I have, quite a few. And of course, there are one or two doctors who support, but they're very much in the minority. The Isle of Man Medical Society survey, which they surveyed, they got responses from 65% of doctors, I think, which is a good proportion of busy doctors responding to a survey. That's pretty much unheard of. And of those, 74% were not in favour of the bill, and that's really worrying for recruitment, especially as a third said that of the respondents said that they would consider leaving the Isle of Man if it became law. I mean, this would be catastrophic for Manx healthcare.
And before you guys came over, have you all spoken to island residents? What is the feeling like here that you all have interpreted?
Well, obviously we're in touch with island residents through Graham and through the local campaign groups here and others as well, and what they're feeding back to us is real concern about not only what's being proposed here, but the speed with which it's being pushed forward within the Tynwald. So I think there is a real case for the Tynwald to take a step back now, and say we just need to think this through properly rather than just rushing ahead.
I speak to a lot of disabled people, actually all over the world, and overwhelmingly they have a lot of fears about this, because the speed with which it's been suggested and pushed through, those who want to change the law pick just different jurisdictions which they favour at different moments in time. It used to be Oregon, then it went to Canada, and then I think a lot of people are really scared about what's happened in Canada. And then they're sort of moving back to Oregon is this perfect model. That there is no perfect model. And when you just ask people to look at all the different implications that come through it. You know, something like Oregon, which doesn't get talked about that much, is the medical records are destroyed a year after the person dies. Like, why are those records being destroyed? You know, what is there to fear from recognising, you know, how a person has died? So there's a lot of things which are deeply, deeply uncomfortable. So I would say out of the thousands of disabled people I've spoken to, I've only come across two who are in favour, and they both think it's not for them. There'll be other disabled people that'll be for. So that's quite an interesting, you know, it's not for me, but it's for you lot over there. So there isn't a huge way of spot. And I try really hard to find people who have a different view of to me, because it's important to listen to other views. And I'm not finding those people.
I think from my side, I think I've covered everything that I need. What would you like to add or say? Anything that I didn't mention that you'd like to mention?
Oh. Christine.
Christine,
yeah. Oh.
Sorry.
So when Gordon, you know, talks about Canada and how quickly that's expanded, you know, now if you're anorexic, you can quest it. It's poverty. But we've got a case which is Christine Gauthier, wheelchair user, veteran. She asked for assistance to build a new ramp to a house. She was offered the drugs to end her life. And, you know, what message does that send out to people? You know, you're not worth a ramp.
Do you feel that could eventually happen here in the years to come if it is passed?
Absolutely. Because, you know, attitudes erode and change over time. And once it comes in, then, you know, it's impossible to stop it. There's already people who think disabled people have no value. They may not say it publicly, but they may think it, and absolutely, that's the way it'll go.
Would you like to add anything?
Yeah, and I mean, there are other cases from Canada. There's a case of Roger Foley, who was in hospital, and he actually recorded the healthcare administrator speaking to him and saying, well, you do realise your care is costing $1,500 a day. Have you considered medical assistance in dying? You know, so, you know, it's that pressure that is applied to people. And, you know, there are other cases, a case of Alan Nichols, who was, you know, had deaf issues and was depressed, went into hospital to have his hearing issues addressed, and ended up being euthanized, you know, and his family found out about it afterwards, or you know, just before it happened. So, you know, he wasn't terminally ill, he wasn't dying, but, you know, he ended up dead. So it's these sorts of horrific stories that are coming out of Canada that we need to bear in mind and say, well, can you guarantee that not one person in the Isle of Man will find themselves in a similar situation? It's not, you know, is this going to be the norm? Is, you know, even one person is an injustice if that's what happens.
Can I ask, with regards to Canada, did their bill start off as it's starting off here on the island and then expand, or did they have all of those ideas already in place?
Well, in Canada, what happened was there was a court case, and then there was a constitutional court ruling that the law prohibiting was unconstitutional. So then the Parliament legislated, and what they legislated for is very similar to what's being proposed in the Isle of Man, which was terminal illness, although they described it as death being reasonably foreseeable, which was interpreted to mean 6 months by the lawyers, which is what's being proposed in the Isle of Man. It was both euthanasia and assisted suicide, where people either self-administer the drugs or the doctor administers the drugs, which is what's being proposed in the Isle of Man as well. So it's a very similar proposal here as to what started happening in Canada. Then, of course, other people challenged that, and there were more court cases, and so the law has been expanded now, and Parliament has passed a new bill, so it now includes people who are not terminally ill, people who have got chronic illness. And there was even a proposal, and Parliament in Canada passed this. It was meant to come in last year, then it was postponed until this year, now it's been postponed again, that people with chronic mental health problems but no physical illness would be able to qualify for this. So what are we saying then? That if somebody's got severe depression or other long-term mental health problems, we're going to give up trying to address that through psychiatric services, and rather we're going to offer them death instead. That's essentially what is being suggested, and that's already happening in Belgium and the Netherlands. So this isn't just something which is a dystopian future. This is actual reality now in some European countries, as well as the fact that disabled children under the age of 12 months in the Netherlands can be euthanized if they have severe disabilities. So essentially infanticide is already happening in the Netherlands. So this is how it expands, and that was never intended and wasn't in the original law in the Netherlands, but it happens because there was a protocol agreed amongst the doctors, and the government hasn't ever stopped it from happening.
And this is what you essentially are trying to prevent from happening now, not only trying to protect the people, but also the future generations.
It's about protecting vulnerable people, and people who will struggle to protect themselves, and it will get to a stage where there'll be people making literally life and death decisions over individuals and telling people that they have no value to society.
Do you want to add anything else?
Yeah, and where you take the issue of euthanasia for children, which, as I say, is happening in the Netherlands, is happening in Belgium, has been proposed in Canada, then there is an issue there about, can children actually give informed consent? We don't give children rights over voting, we don't give them rights to drive cars, we limit children's choices because they, for their own good, because they are unable to give fully informed consent until they get to an appropriate age. And yet, we're giving other people the right to decide whether their lives should be ended because of disability or other illnesses. And it seems to me that is a very worrying development, because it's no longer about individual autonomy as it's presented as being about. It's actually about third parties making those choices. And I mean, other examples from the Netherlands, for example, and Belgium, are where people are unable, adults are unable to give consent. They may be in hospital, they may be in a coma, or there may be other reasons, advanced dementia, where they cannot give consent, and yet third parties are making value judgments about their lives and making those decisions for them.
MHK Alex Allinson was also part of that meeting. He told me that he addressed their concerns.
I was part of the audience, yes. You're quite right. The debate about assisted dying and the bill going through the House of Keys is still very much an ongoing process. We've got a committee looking into it at the moment. So Tanni Grey-Thompson came over, and also a representative from a group called Care Not Killing, and they spoke to Tynwald members about their concerns about assisted dying legislation on the Isle of Man.
Right now, when listening to some of their concerns, would you be able to share with me what were some of your thoughts, maybe?
Yes, certainly. I mean, Tanni Grey-Thompson is a Paralympian and a very strong advocate for disability rights, and made it a very strong case for both access for disabled people, or for a whole range of things, including transport, but also people's attitude to people with disabilities, and gave her own personal stories of how that's affected her and her family. And I think that really resonated with Tynwald members. Obviously, we have equality legislation here, but actually it's making it deliver for people with disabilities, for all sorts of disabilities. And she was concerned that assisted dying legislation might add to that negative connotation about people with disabilities. I very much made the case that our legislation as it's drafted doesn't mention disabilities at all. It's purely about somebody with a terminal illness who's expected to die within the next 6 months, who's resident on the Isle of Man, and who has capacity. So it wouldn't just include somebody with disability. It wouldn't include somebody with something like autism or another neurodevelopmental issue there. But obviously, if somebody was disabled and then had a terminal illness and wanted assisted dying and had capacity, they'd be able to access it. So we picked apart some of those issues and some of those concerns. And from a Care Not Killing perspective, they were concerned that although you may start off with quite a few restrictions on the legislation, those would, in their view, inevitably widen to encompass a whole range of different eligibility criteria, and used examples such as Belgium and the Netherlands and Canada as well, where the access to assisted dying is expanded. And I very much made the case that on the Isle of Man, because of the structure of our legislation and our parliament, those sort of changes couldn't be dictated by the courts, but could be confined by well-written, well-grounded legislation and a good parliamentary process.
Right. Now, I'm glad that you mentioned it, because those were the same concerns that they shared with me. I know you say that it cannot be changed by the courts here on the Isle of Man. What sort of protections can you put into place to assure people that have these fears? Because maybe not now, but maybe 10, 15, 20 years from now, when you're not in this post, someone else is going to be in it. Like, what kind of protections or assurances can you give to ensure that, you know, it's set in stone?
Yeah. Well, I, that's a very good point. And any legislation has to be written really carefully, which is why we've taken a lot of time debating the assisted dying bill, why we will continue to do that through the clauses stage, and why at every point during the bill, if there are to be any changes or regulations laid, they then have to be brought before Tynwald and brought before the people of the Isle of Man. Now, on the Isle of Man, we have the primacy of our Parliament, of Tynwald. It can't be overruled by Supreme Courts in the same way as Westminster can't. Canada was slightly different. That's why some of their laws were changed. So really, in the future, 10, 15 years' time, it would only be through our Parliament that changes could be made. Now, I can't predict what public opinion will be in 10 years' time, whether the bill, even if it was passed, might be repealed. And we've seen that in lots of other legislations where some hard-fought-for rights are actually repealed by further administrations. But what I'd like to do is absolutely make sure that people's opinions are taken into account, that the ability for Tynwald to make any changes in the future, whether they reverse an assisted dying bill or perhaps look at it and refine it, is there, but has to be done in a completely open and democratic way.
No, that's perfect. I think my last question would be, you spoke about people's opinions mattering. How has it been for you? I mean, you're getting both sides of how people are feeling. Is it kind of eye-opening because you're seeing or you're hearing things maybe that's out of the box or something that you probably wouldn't have taken into consideration or probably thought of but wasn't sure how to link it?
Yeah, I mean, I've personally spent a lot of time thinking about assisted dying, researching how it's been expanded in other jurisdictions, and also looking at the arguments for and against. Again, I completely respect the points of view of people like Tanni Grey-Thompson and other people who are opposed to assisted dying. And if they don't want to take that up, it's absolutely fine. But I am still committed to bringing forward some legislation that allows that very small number of people who are facing a terminal illness and facing death, who want to have the autonomy and choice over how and when they die, to be able to have that on our island. And I think that's very important. And as I said, something that I'll be bringing back to Tynwald once we have the committee report, which hopefully will be finished by the end of this month.
Thank you for making it to the end of the Little Manx Radio newscast. You are obviously someone with exquisite taste. May I politely suggest you might want to subscribe to this and a wide range of Manx Radio podcasts at your favourite podcast provider, so our best bits will magically appear on your smartphone. Thank you.